The rain had barely stopped in downtown Seattle when Michael Carrington, a man once known for building tech empires, sat motionless on his living room sofa. Across the room, his 8-year-old daughter, Grace, clutched a worn-out teddy bear, her only shield against a world she hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. Since the night a drunk driver stole her mother's life, silence had been her prison. Therapists had tried. Specialists had tried. Even Michael, with all his wealth and influence, had tried. Nothing worked. Until one ordinary afternoon, when a simple trip to a small corner cafe would change everything. He wasn't looking for miracles, just a quiet place to talk business with an old friend. But the moment they stepped inside, Grace's gaze locked on a young woman behind the counter. A woman with kind eyes and hands that moved like poetry. In seconds, Grace did something Michael thought he might never see again. She smiled. Why did those gentle hands reach her when every voice had failed? Who was this mysterious woman who spoke without sound, yet touched a wounded child's heart? And what would happen when the truth about her past threatened to tear them apart? Stay until the end, because in this story, love doesn't arrive with grand speeches. It arrives in silence. Subscribe to John's Stories for more unforgettable dramas every day.
Seattle, on a quiet Monday morning, wore a gray stillness that matched Michael Carrington's heart. The luxury high-rise around him felt less like a home and more like an elegant cage. Glass walls and polished floors that reflected a life that had once been vibrant, now stripped bare. Michael, 36, had been the kind of man whose name carried weight in the tech world. A gifted software engineer turned founder of a rising AI startup. But today, he wasn't a CEO, a visionary, or a man with a plan. He was simply a father who couldn't fix the one problem that mattered most. On the plush rug near the window, Grace sat curled up, her knees tucked close, the frayed ear of her teddy bear pressed to her cheek. Her hair, long and tangled from days without care, fell forward, hiding her small face. But Michael didn't need to see her eyes to know what was there. Emptiness. It had been 365 days since that night. The crash, the phone call, the hospital corridor with its sterile smell and blinding white lights, the doctor's voice breaking the air with words that still rang in his mind. "I'm sorry, we couldn't save her." Emily, his wife, Grace's mother, gone in an instant. And with her, Grace's voice had vanished too. At first, Michael thought it was grief that would fade with time, but the weeks turned into months, and her silence became its own unbreakable wall. He had thrown everything at it: speech therapy, art therapy, acupuncture, mindfulness sessions. He'd flown her to Boston, to San Francisco, chasing the most respected specialists money could buy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars later, Grace was still silent, still locked away inside herself. One therapist had said something that stuck with him. "Maybe she doesn't need another treatment, Mr. Carrington. Maybe she needs a reason to come back." But what did that even mean? Michael could debug 1,000 lines of code, architect a complex neural network, predict market behavior with precision. Yet here, facing his own child, he had no algorithm, no formula, no way in. The soft buzz of his phone on the coffee table pulled him from his thoughts. The name on the screen read Jason Miller. Jason had been with him since the early days of the startup. Friend, co-founder, the one person who could still get him to pick up the phone. "Mike, can you meet me at Pine Street Cafe around noon? Got updates on the Tokyo deal." Michael hesitated. He hadn't been to a public meeting in weeks, maybe months. The idea of leaving Grace alone tugged at his chest. But another part of him knew that he couldn't hide forever, and maybe, just maybe, it would be good for Grace to step outside. He looked over at her. "Sweetheart, His voice was gentle, almost cautious. "Would you like to come out with me today, just for a little while?" No answer. But when he bent down to put on his shoes, she slowly rose, walked to him, and reached for his hand. Such a small act. But for Michael, it was monumental. A flicker of life. On the drive to the cafe, Michael stole glances in the rearview mirror. Grace sat quietly, teddy bear still in her arms, eyes fixed on the passing streets. She wasn't smiling, but the vacant fog in her gaze seemed, just barely, thinner. He didn't know it yet, but in less than an hour, that fragile light would grow brighter than it had in a year.
The Pine Street Cafe was one of those places that seemed to breathe with its own quiet rhythm. Tucked between old brick buildings and framed by a hand-painted sign, it had been there long before the tech boom transformed the city. Its large windows caught the Seattle light in soft streaks, filtering it over polished wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and shelves lined with vintage coffee tins. For Michael, it was more than a cafe. It was the place where he and Jason had signed their first major contract over paper cups of burnt espresso, years before they could afford marble conference tables and executive suites. A place where big dreams had felt possible and uncomplicated. The door's brass bell jingled softly as Michael stepped inside, Grace's small hand clasped in his like it might vanish if he let go. The warm air carried the scent of ground coffee beans, fresh pastries, and something sweeter, like vanilla and cinnamon braided together. Jason was already there, seated at a corner table by the window, tapping at his tablet. He stood the moment he saw them. "Hey, Grace, it's been a while." His voice was warm, his smile easy. Grace pressed herself a little closer to Michael's side, eyes lowered. Michael returned Jason's greeting with a polite nod before pulling out a chair for Grace. She sat down, teddy bear resting on her lap, a small anchor in a big world. Jason dove straight into business. Contract clauses, investment updates, shifting market trends in Asia. Michael took notes mechanically, his pen scratching across the page, but his mind was elsewhere. Every few moments, his gaze flickered to Grace. Her eyes drifted around the room without focus, as if she were there but not truly seeing. And then something shifted. From the open kitchen, a young woman emerged carrying a tray of pastries so fresh the steam curled gently above them. She was wearing a cream apron dusted with flour, her dark hair tied back neatly. Her eyes, sharp but kind, scanned the tables as she moved. Her name was Sofia Delgado. When her gaze found Grace, something subtle changed. Her smile softened, not the polite customer service smile Michael had seen 100 times before, but a look of recognition. Not as though she knew Grace, but as though she understood something unspoken. Sophia placed the tray on the counter, but instead of walking away, she paused, tilting her head slightly, studying Grace the way an artist studies light and shadow. Michael noticed. There was no pity in her expression, no intrusive curiosity, just attentiveness. Then she crossed the short distance to their table and crouched down to Grace's level. Her hands began to move, not in restless fidgeting, but in deliberate, graceful shapes. Fingers forming arcs, palms turning gently, gestures flowing from one to the next. Sign language. Her eyes never left Grace's, holding them without pressure, without demand. It was like one silent soul calling to another. Michael froze. So did Jason, though for different reasons. And then the impossible. A tiny curve touched the corner of Grace's lips. Not the polite reflex smile children give strangers, a real one. Faint, but alive. Michael's breath caught. He hadn't seen that expression since before the accident. Sophia kept signing, her movements slow and gentle, coaxing without forcing. Grace watched intently as if the language bypassed whatever wall had kept the world out. Then after a long pause, Grace lifted one small hand and tried to mimic a few of the shapes. The motions were clumsy, but deliberate. Jason leaned closer to Michael, his voice low. "Who is she?" Michael didn't answer. He was afraid that speaking aloud might shatter the fragile moment taking shape in front of him. Finally, Sophia looked up at him, her hand spelling hello, before she spoke aloud, her voice carrying a soft Latin American lilt. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. She just seemed uncomfortable. I thought maybe I could help." Michael rose slightly from his seat. "I'm Michael. This is my daughter, Grace. Thank you for whatever that was." Sophia smiled lightly. "I'm a baker here, and I've been deaf since birth." She said it like she might say, "I have brown eyes," a fact, not a confession. "She knows a few basic signs," Sophia continued, nodding towards Grace. "I think she was trying to say, 'Ha ha,' and 'I like your smile.' Not perfect, but I understood." Michael stood there, momentarily without words, not because of what Sophia had said, but because of what had just happened. For the first time in a year, he felt something that almost frightened him to admit: hope.
The rain had come back overnight, a light silver mist that hung over the city, as if draped there by some unseen hand. By morning, the clouds sagged low, brushing the rooftops. Seattle felt muffled, as though someone had turned the volume down on the whole world. Michael Carrington stood in the elevator of his building, watching the glowing numbers rise one by one. The panel wasn't just counting floors, it was counting something more: patience, courage, the fragile distance between who he had been and who he might still need to become. He hadn't intended to return to Pine Street Cafe so soon after yesterday, but here he was, buttoning his coat as Grace pulled her pale blue hoodie over her small frame. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't have to. Some bonds tug without words. The cafe greeted them with its usual brass bell chime, the warm, familiar scent of espresso and sugar curling in the air. Light from the large front windows draped across the wooden tables, pooling around mismatched chairs. Behind the counter, Sofia Delgado slid a pan of pastries onto a cooling rack, steam spiraling gently upward. She glanced up, and the moment her eyes found Grace, that same spark from the day before seemed to flare again, like it had been waiting for her return. Michael approached, feeling the old, unwelcome awkwardness in his movements. Confidence had once been his currency, spent freely without worry. But in this new chapter, humility was the more valuable coin. "I don't usually come to the same place 2 days in a row," he began, his voice careful, the way one might handle something fragile. "Yesterday, what you did, thank you." Sophia wiped her hands on her flour-dusted apron and stepped out from behind the counter. Her gaze moved between father and daughter, reading not just faces, but the smaller languages of posture, breathing, stillness. "She seemed nervous about the noise," Sophia said, aloud, while her fingers translated the gist. "Busy rooms can feel like storms. Hands can calm storms. Would you—" He hesitated, choosing his words with the precision of a man making a high-stakes decision. "Would you consider teaching her? Not a formal thing, just what you did yesterday." Sophia's pause wasn't rejection. It was the weight of responsibility. From the kitchen, a timer's steady red blink reminded her of dough rising. "I'm not a teacher," she said, signing not and teacher as she spoke. "I bake. I help where I can." 5 therapists tried, Michael said, his voice quieter now. "They gave me methods. You gave her a smile. No mention of his wealth, his influence, or the city's recognition of his name. Only the truth." Sophia considered, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. Outside, a city bus hissed to a stop, then pulled away, leaving silence in its wake. 1 hour, she said finally, signing 1 hour, no pressure. After school. We'll see. We'll listen. Grace's shoulders relaxed, just a fraction, but enough for Michael to notice. He nodded. After school. And just like that, a quiet agreement was born. Their first lesson took place at a small table near the kitchen pass-through. The cafe carried on around them, Steam wands hissed, keyboards clicked, conversations flowed, but in that corner, time seemed to slow to the pace of a hand-cranked clock. Sophia began with greetings, the foundation stones of every human connection. Hello, palm forward, a gentle wave. Thank you, fingers brushing from chin outward. Please, a flat palm circling over the chest. Grace watched, then attempted the motions herself, hesitant, imprecise, but deliberate. Each imperfect gesture still counted as a crossing from her world into another. When frustration flickered in her expression, a tight brow, a stiff wrist, Sophia slowed her own movements, breaking them down into smaller, more manageable beats, like a baker folding butter into flour, bit by bit until it blended. Michael sat nearby, his laptop open but untouched. He let the cafe's ambient hum replace the constant churn of emails and financial forecasts. Each time Grace's fingers moved, something inside him loosened. This wasn't treatment, it was literacy, language slipping in through her eyes when her ears and voice refused to open. Days began to fall into a pattern. School first, then the cafe. Grace's cocoa was always set just slightly to the left because she seemed to prefer it that way. There was always something fresh from the oven, because the smell of sugar and warmth softened even the sharpest edges of a hard day. Some afternoons they learned 5 signs. On tougher days, just 1, repeated until it felt right. And sometimes there was no lesson at all, only presence, a silent agreement to share the same air until the storms passed. During breaks, Sophia told stories, half in spoken words for those listening nearby, half in signs for Grace's eyes alone. She had been born in Mendoza, Argentina, where summer air smelled of grapes and winter carried the scent of dust and wood smoke. Her grandmother, refusing to let deafness become isolation, learned sign language alongside her. The kitchen table became their classroom. She made language with me, like bread, like braids, like ties that hold, she signed. Grace listened with an attentiveness Michael hadn't seen in months. Sophia's teaching was anchored in tangible references, tapping a knuckle on a mug for cup, a gentle pat over the heart for feelings, 2 fingers walking across the palm for go. She built bridges from the bedrock, never in midair.
Not every day was smooth. One Wednesday, a blender shrieked too loud, and Grace jolted, spilling cocoa like a small brown cloud across the table. She froze, panic tightening her small shoulders. Before dread could set them back to 0, Sophia signed safe, palms closing over fists like lids, and calmly placed a napkin in Grace's open hand, guiding her to press, blot, lift. Control returned, little by little. The stain lightened. They breathed again. Michael began to read the microgrammar of his daughter's body. A pause before a sign meant she was choosing her words. A quick dart of the eyes meant she felt rushed. Softening shoulders meant the day had gone well enough. He also learned a humbler truth. Sometimes the best thing he could do was step back and let Sophia lead. It took a certain bravery, he realized, for a parent to allow someone else to be the bridge. One afternoon, after a week of steady progress, Grace signed slowly, "Mom, where?" The question hung in the air like a struck bell. Michael's breath faltered. Old grief surged like a tide over the seawall he had built from busy schedules and work. Sophia didn't rush to answer. She acknowledged the question first, then brought 2 fingers together and lifted them toward the sky. Heaven. The sign was simple. The meaning was vast. That evening, as Michael rinsed dishes at the sink, Grace touched his sleeve and signed, "Thank you." The gesture was halting but intentional, like the first push of a bicycle that doesn't end in a fall. He turned his face slightly, not to hide tears, but to let them exist without scrutiny. The outside world kept spinning. Markets moved, competitors launched, emails stacked into neat little towers. But Michael began pruning his commitments like a gardener removing excess branches. Morning calls stayed, late-night marathons of work were cut. Afternoons became sacred, not for business deals, but for the lift of Grace's eyebrows when she understood a sign, or the way Sophia's hands adjusted hers with patience instead of impatience. Regulars at the cafe began to notice the new ritual. A graduate student quietly moved tables to give them more space. An older man in a pea coat set his newspaper down without its usual sharp snap. People, Michael thought, often become gentler when shown how. Sophia carried her own scars quietly. There had been debts in Buenos Aires she hadn't earned but had inherited, documents she'd signed for a father who loved her clumsily and left complications behind. Nights spent counting flour sacks like budgets. Survival had shaped her patience. It was an elastic kind of strength, born of having to make do without breaking. Grace learned more than vocabulary. She learned that hands could mean comfort, not just correction. That eye contact could be a rope to steady yourself, not a challenge to endure. That some adults would wait for her instead of pulling her along by the wrist. She began to arrive at the cafe with her hoodie unzipped, a small flag of willingness to be seen. One Friday, the rain lifted long enough to leave the streets silver. The door chimed and a woman entered with a boy about 10, wearing noise-canceling headphones, tapping his fingers against his thigh in staccato rhythm. The mother's eyes carried the alertness of someone who loved a child in a world that didn't always love back. When the boy flinched at the grinder's roar, Sophia stepped out, signed, "You're okay," palms down, gently pressing, then mimed a choice between a small table inside or the quieter back patio. The boy watched her hands, then nodded toward the patio. The mother's gratitude was wordless but clear. Grace saw the whole thing, saw herself reflected in another child's overwhelm, and saw that accommodation wasn't pity, it was design. There were difficult days, missed naps, unexpected changes, delivery trucks beeping in reverse. On those days, Sophia scaled back to a single grounding sign: breathe, hand floating from mouth outward, repeated until calm returned. And joy found its way in. Grace learned cupcake with fierce seriousness, touching thumb to middle finger and lifting toward her mouth, then pointing at the chocolate ones as if she had discovered a law of nature. She learned teddy bear, wrapping her arms around herself, then bowing slightly to her plush companion as though introducing royalty. One afternoon, she tapped Michael's hand and signed "Dad," thumb to forehead, fingers spread, waiting to see if the word would hold. It did. He signed it back, meaning, "It's ours now." Jason visited occasionally, his energy still tethered to the pulse of startups and roadmaps. He watched a lesson one afternoon, then said to Michael, half joking, half serious, "You used to light up at traction charts. Now you look like a guy watching the Northern Lights." Michael didn't disagree. Some metrics, he thought, mattered more than revenue, like the curve of a child's smile or the ease of her breath. As winter approached, the cafe's windows fogged from the meeting of cold and warmth. Sophia began teaching words for feelings: sad, a pulled mouth; brave, a lifted chin; tired, fingers brushing the cheek. Naming things gave them edges, and edges made them holdable. Grace embraced brave, showing it twice in a row after managing the blender noise without flinching. Michael signed it back, not as praise, but as recognition. "I see your courage." After closing, Sophia sometimes invited Grace into the kitchen to bake. Flour dusted their hands like first snow. They kneaded dough, press, fold, turn, in a rhythm older than grief itself. The dough resisted, then yielded, as all resilient things do. When the timer chimed and the loaf emerged browned and crackling, Grace touched it with reverence, as if victory itself had a crust. On the first frosty night, Michael walked them to the car under a clear, polished sky. Grace, buckled in, signed a good night to Sophia through the window. "Thank you, see you," a tentative happy. Sophia answered each sign, adding a new one, proud, hand arcing from chest outward, eyes warm. Michael closed the door gently, understanding that pride, given in the right measure, is fuel, not pressure. There were still unresolved edges, a board meeting he dreaded, articles about company expansion he no longer wanted to read, an aging mother whose expectations arrived like thick winter envelopes, heavy with implied instructions. Those currents would reach shore soon enough. But for now, in the glow of the cafe, a father, a daughter, and a baker kept tracing small, steady lines toward one another, and the lines were holding.
The days that followed moved with the quiet momentum of winter, slow but steady, each one adding its own thin layer of change. Outside, holiday lights began appearing in shop windows, tiny constellations against the gray Seattle sky. Inside the cafe, the smell of cinnamon rolls and ginger cookies wrapped itself around anyone who walked in. Michael had been avoiding public statements for weeks. The Tokyo deal was in its final stages, and the board was watching closely. But as whispers began circling about Sophia, about him, about what this might mean for the company, he knew he couldn't let the narrative be written by strangers. So when a press conference had been scheduled to showcase the company's upcoming educational technology line, Michael made a decision. He wouldn't just talk about algorithms and product features. He would talk about people. The room was filled with reporters, cameras clicking like distant rain. Michael stood at the podium, his hand resting lightly on Grace's shoulder. She wore a soft gray dress, her hair brushed neatly, and clutched her teddy bear in one arm. "I'm dating an extraordinary woman," he began, his voice calm but carrying. The room stilled, the faint rustle of notepads pausing mid-page. She doesn't hear like we do, but she listens with her whole heart. There was a beat of silence, the kind that could tip either into judgment or applause. Then slowly at first, the clapping began, genuine, unforced, spreading through the room until it filled the air. Grace's eyes darted toward the sound, then back to him, as if to check that it was safe to enjoy. Michael didn't need to look at Sophia, standing off to the side, to know she was smiling. The months after that moment moved like a thaw. Sophia opened her own bakery, a small, warm space on the corner of Maple and Ninth. She named it Sweet Roots, a nod to both her love of baking and her belief that sweetness had to be grown from somewhere deep. The interior was a mix of rustic wood tables, bright jars of preserves on open shelves, and a chalkboard wall where customers could doodle or write a favorite word in any language. On the first day, Grace stood by the counter wearing a little apron, helping to hand out cookies. When a customer signed, "Thank you," instead of saying it, her whole face lit up. The bakery quickly became more than a business. It became a gathering place for the deaf community, a safe spot for parents with children who needed quieter spaces, and a meeting ground for anyone curious about the language of hands. Sophia hosted weekend workshops, sign language basics, baking classes, storytelling through gestures. Grace attended every one, often acting as Sophia's assistant. At school, Grace's transformation didn't go unnoticed. She began introducing classmates to some of her deaf friends from Sweet Roots. At recess, she'd teach a few signs: friend, play, happy, and organize games that didn't need shouting to be fun. Teachers reported she was participating more, using both voice and sign. The shy girl who once kept her eyes down was now a connector, pulling others into her circle. One spring afternoon, Michael arrived at the bakery to pick her up and found her leading a small group of children in a game where each had to sign their favorite animal. The room was full of laughter, silent in some corners, noisy in others, but all threaded together by shared joy. Life didn't become perfect. No life does. There were still days when Grace's voice caught,
when old fears flared up. There were times Sophia felt the weight of running a business and being a mentor, the balancing act exhausting her. Michael still navigated investor calls and market pressures. But the difference was visible. Where there used to be isolation, there was now community. Where there was only silence, there were now choices. Voice, sign, or both. And where there had been 3 separate lives, there was now one shared home, even if the home had more than 4 walls. One evening, the 3 of them sat in the small garden behind Sweet Roots. The air carried a faint trace of vanilla from the day's baking. Grace was drawing with colored chalk on the patio stones, sketching a cake with flowers on top. "Is this for a special occasion?" Michael asked, leaning over. Grace nodded, signing as she spoke. "If you and Sophia get married, I'll make the wedding cake." Sophia laughed, her eyes bright. "Oh, and what flavor would it be?" "Vanilla and strawberry," Grace answered without hesitation. Then her expression grew serious. "And there has to be a sign language interpreter. Everyone needs to understand how beautiful love is." The words, both spoken and signed, seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Sophia reached out, pulling Grace close, unable to stop the tears. Michael sat quietly, letting the moment settle over them like the scent of fresh bread. Months later, in early summer, Sophia stood in the garden again, this time in a soft cream dress, sunlight catching in her hair. Friends and family gathered, some speaking, some signing, all sharing the same quiet excitement. Grace moved between them with ease, greeting each guest in both voice and sign, switching as naturally as breathing. In one corner, Margaret sat with a cup of tea, watching her granddaughter glow in the late afternoon light. There had been a time she had doubted Sophia, doubted the fit, but seeing Grace now, confident, engaged, radiant, she understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about who Michael had chosen. It was about the life they were all choosing together. When the ceremony began, Grace stood between them, holding both their hands. And when it came time for the vows, Sophia did something instinctive. She spoke them aloud and signed them at the same time. Every word, every movement, carried the weight of the journey that had brought them here. Later that night, as the last guests drifted away and the lanterns in the garden flickered low, Grace curled up on a bench beside Sophia, resting her head against her. Michael joined them, slipping an arm around them both. Sophia glanced at Grace, then at Michael. "We're not perfect," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We're not traditional, but we are exactly who we're meant to be." Michael nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep. Grace lifted her head just long enough to sign one word, family, before closing her eyes again. And in that quiet, with the scent of sugar still in the air and the night holding them close, they knew love didn't need to be explained. It only needed to be lived.
Summer drifted into autumn with the ease of a page turning. The air grew crisper, the evenings a little earlier, and the bakery's chalkboard menu began to fill with spiced cider, pumpkin loaves, and apple tarts. Sweet Roots had been open less than a year, but it already felt like an anchor in the neighborhood, a place where faces were familiar and greetings were given in more than one language. Grace had grown taller, her once tangled hair now neatly braided most days. She moved with a quiet confidence, whether she was behind the counter passing a customer their order or sitting at a table teaching a curious child how to sign cookie. Her voice still came in bursts, soft, sometimes hesitant, but it was no longer the rare, fragile thing it once was. Michael noticed how people no longer looked at her with pity or polite confusion. They engaged with her on her terms, sometimes speaking, sometimes signing, often both. She had become the bridge that connected two worlds for those willing to meet her halfway. One Saturday afternoon, after the rush had passed, Sophia locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. The three of them sat at one of the big wooden tables, sharing the last slice of apple pie from the morning. Outside, leaves danced across the sidewalk in a warm breeze. Grace set her fork down, glanced between them, and signed, "You know, I like who I am now." Michael's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" Grace's hands moved again, slow and deliberate. "Before, I was small and quiet because I was scared. Now, I am still quiet sometimes, but it's not because I am afraid. It's because I'm listening." Sophia reached across the table, taking her hand. "That's the most beautiful thing you could have said." Life was still imperfect. There were busy days when the bakery's ovens malfunctioned, or when Michael had to juggle investor calls and school pickup in the same hour. There were moments when Grace's old fears still flickered at the edges. Loud noises, unfamiliar crowds. But the difference now was that they faced those moments together. On difficult days, Sophia would sign "breathe" and "safe" until the tension eased. Michael would adjust his schedule, trading an afternoon meeting for an hour at the park. Grace had learned she didn't have to carry her fears alone, and that perhaps the real courage wasn't in getting over them, but in letting others stand beside her while she faced them. One evening in late October, they hosted a small event at the bakery, Stories in Silence. Members of the deaf community and their families gathered in the softly lit space, sharing personal stories through sign language, while an interpreter translated for hearing guests. Grace sat in the front row, her eyes wide, hands resting in her lap. When the evening wound down, Sophia invited her to share something, assuring her she didn't have to if she wasn't ready. She hesitated, then stood. She began to sign a simple memory, the first time she met Sophia at Pine Street Cafe. She described, in movements and expressions, how she had felt seen, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth understanding. By the time she finished, the room was quiet. Then came the applause, some loud, some in the silent wave of hands that is the deaf community's way of cheering. Grace smiled, wide and unguarded. Later, walking home in the cool night, Michael thought about the journey that had brought them here. He remembered the long months of silence, the failed therapies, the feeling of powerlessness. He remembered the moment in the cafe when Sophia first reached Grace with her hands, and how that single connection had changed the course of their lives. It hadn't been a grand plan or a perfectly engineered solution. It had been small steps, gentle persistence, and the courage to let love look different than expected. Final takeaway for the audience. Life doesn't always give us the exact answers we search for. Sometimes it gives us something better, a person, a moment, or a quiet act of understanding that unlocks a door we didn't know could open. Michael had spent a year trying to fix his daughter's silence. What he learned instead was that she didn't need fixing, she needed connection, and connection often comes in unexpected forms. A smile, a shared language, a patient teacher who refuses to rush the process. Grace found her voice, not just in sound, but in movement, in the ability to express herself on her own terms. Sophia found a family she hadn't been looking for, but had always deserved. And Michael learned that strength isn't always about leading from the front. Sometimes it's about stepping back so someone else can be the bridge. To anyone watching, remember this. The way you choose to connect with someone matters far more than the method. You don't have to speak the same language to understand each other. You only have to be willing to listen with your whole heart. And in the end, that's what love is. Not grand speeches or perfect circumstances, but the everyday choice to stay, to understand, and to build something together, one small sign, one quiet moment at a time. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, made you think, consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. Subscribe our channel for more powerful stories about love, self-growth, and human connection, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next emotional journey.